Thank you for joining us today. It's been an exciting time for us in Labuan IBFC and ZN are preparing for this report, and we're very excited to introduce it to you today. We've had a lot of questions as to why Labuan IBFC will be interested in working with ZN on the production of a report like this. And really, you know, when the team at ZN and the team at Labuan sat down and discussed it, we felt there was a natural coming together of synergies between digitalization and inclusion. And then we started to look at the push vis-a-vis inclusion at the jurisdictional level, and how, if you look at international financial centers as the global plumbing mechanism, you'll see that it is extremely important that once wholesale intermediation of financial services does occur when we cross borders, the ethos of inclusion continues. And therein lies the role of international financial centers. So really, you know, in the new world that we live in, it's important for all of us to consider inclusion, to raise the boat for all of us. And this is where the thinking came from. So I'd really like to thank the team at ZN for this. I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. Also, I hope the report resonates, and I'd like to now welcome Simon. Simon is an associate at ZN, and he'll go through some of the research findings for us, and then we'll follow through with a panel discussion. Oh, but before we listen to Simon, let's listen into our messages from our friends at Global Digital Finance and Innovate UK.
I'm Lawrence Wintermeyer, the Executive Co-Chair of Global Digital Finance. As we see the tide turning on COVID-19 and the green shoots of economic recovery, policymakers and capital allocators alike are focused on building back better. But what does this mean for citizens and their access to finance? It's estimated that over 1.7 billion people in the world have no access to banks or mobile money services. And this is not just in the developing world. In many Western countries, estimates of between 10 and 30% of citizens have no access to bank accounts, poor access to credit, and little opportunity to save or have a pension. I hope that Building Back Better focuses all of us in the financial services sector to achieve greater financial inclusion. A new generation of digital technologies and applications has emerged, including the blockchain and distributed ledger technology. Fintech and peer-to-peer finance, or DeFi, as it's often referred to, offer a fast, efficient, transparent, and safe access to finance for consumers. On the 5th anniversary of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, let us ensure that as we now race towards net zero, we take stock of the new digital tools that can help us get more people in the world in a reliable financial system. This new era of digital financial market infrastructure and its applications will transform financial services for all citizens in a similar way that the mobile phone has transformed our life, and give us real-time access to bona fide financial products and services. I encourage you to read the new report from our friends at ZN Consulting in partnership with the Labuan International Business and Financial Center on this most pressing call to action. I'm Lawrence Wintermeyer, and thank you for listening.
We at Innovate Finance, the industry body for UK FinTech, warmly welcome this incredibly important report by ZN and the Labuan International Business and Financial Center on facilitating financial inclusion through digitalization. Ensuring universal access to financial products and utilities features in 8 of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and FinTech has a key role to play in achieving these objectives. Technology and innovation is transforming the financial services landscape, increasing access to faster, cheaper, and more efficient financial services for individuals and SMEs around the world. It's critical that we all, industry, government, regulators, and academia, now work together to create a more democratic, inclusive, and transparent financial services sector for all.
Well, as the world begins to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, populations and politicians are questioning the sort of normality that we should return to. The all-consuming nature of COVID-19 temporarily obscured issues such as climate change and poverty. But as the dark clouds begin to lift, these issues are being thrown into sharp relief. As the world's economy is being rebuilt, the public and policymakers alike are demanding a course correction, and they're looking to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a template for redevelopment. In the research, which was commissioned and co-written by Labuan, we explore the role that international financial centres can play in the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, we focus on how they can facilitate financial inclusion using new and emerging digital technologies, how they can act as a catalyst for positive innovation, and how they can foster debate with policymakers on sustainable and equitable development. So let's actually begin by unpicking the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are a set of 17 goals which were developed by the United Nations back in 2016. They incorporate interlinked environmental and economic objectives which aim to deliver economic growth whilst tackling climate change and working to preserve the natural environment. Now, interest in the SDGs has built steadily in the 5 years since their adoption, and increasingly, the financial services sector is looking to the SDGs as a model for corporate strategy. So where does financial inclusion actually fit into this picture? Well, resting at the heart of the SDGs is the concept of agency, the ability of an individual to make choices, contribute to society, and affect their own destiny. Without financial inclusion, there can be no agency. And although at first glance it appears that only 3 of the SDGs are directly related to financial inclusion actually has some bearing on each and every one of the goals. Historically, financial systems have struggled to address social and environmental issues, and this has led to somewhat of a crisis of confidence in capitalism. And rest assured, this is actually going to be thrown into even sharper relief if we don't get the COVID recovery right. Now, for the last 2 years, the World Economic Forum event in Davos has focused on trying to turn the tide of this disillusionment. And it's encouraging policymakers to change stockholder capitalism into stakeholder capitalism. And under this philosophy, a company's purpose is not to maximize short-term profits, but actually to create long-term value. So where do financial centres actually fit into this picture? Well, the financial centre has 2 very powerful tools with which to actually deliver against this shifting agenda: responsible finance and fintech. Responsible finance describes any financial services activity which results in a positive change for the environment and society over the long term. And over the last 2 decades, an increasing focus on environmental, social and governance issues and the rise of new financial issues such as green bonds means that green finance is no longer seen as a fringe concern, but is actually a profitable and desirable activity which drives financial markets, serves society, and actually enhances the status of financial centres which can demonstrate expertise. Financial technology, or fintech, is a generic term which is used to describe information and communication technology that enhances and automates the delivery and use of financial services. It's actually where these 2 areas overlap that the potential for transformative change exists. Let's have a look at some of the products and services which are leading the charge. Identity is a fundamental enabler for innovation and trust in financial services. According to the World Bank, there are an estimated 1 billion people who lack an official identity. Without an official identity, individuals are excluded from public services such as health, education, and of course the democratic process. From a financial institution's perspective, knowing who you're doing business with is absolutely essential to avoid fraud and theft. Blockchain solutions can provide a range of options which allow the creation of secure digital identities, which enable access to services and minimize the potential for fraud. Mobile banking gives 3.8 billion people, or about 69% of the world's adults, access to a bank account through a mobile money provider. Providing access to the remaining 31% of the planet's population is a priority if these people are going to be lifted out of poverty. To date, mobile network operators have pursued mobile banking in developing countries with very little support from traditional financial institutions. This must change, and IFCs are the ideal catalysts to ensure that consumers are protected by supporting mobile network operators as they fold their banking operations into existing regulatory frameworks. Now, the insurance sector were early adopters of fintech, and examples include the black boxes placed inside motorist cars and the development of wearable technology such as Fitbits. However, in developing countries, insurance is still very much a service for the wealthy, and it's largely entirely absent from rural communities. However, the rapid spread of smartphones and strong community ties mean that web-enabled P2P insurance is set for very rapid growth, and some centres, such as Labuan, have actually embraced this new market. Crowdfunding enables communities to raise funds for local infrastructure projects and services. Generally, the sums raised are very small, tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars. However, crowdfunding has actually improved an effective way to engage millennial investors, and leadership from financial centres could actually bring this small but as yet untapped market into the mainstream. So, we've looked at the problems and we've identified a range of solutions. Where do international financial centres actually fit into this picture? Well, the world has more than 100 international financial centres, facilitating the movement of global trade, finance, investment and wealth. As well as being large employers themselves, Labuan, for example, employs over 6,000 people, IFCs actually provide the underlying financial activities that enable real economic investment in housing, in businesses and infrastructure to take place. Because IFCs actually play a role in sculpting the financial landscape, they naturally have a role in the delivery of the SDGs. IFCs have got to step up to the plate though, and they can do this in three ways. They can ensure there is a supportive regulatory environment which provides a strong platform for responsible finance. They can create a framework that supports experimentation and innovation in new products and services which actually deliver inclusive outcomes. And they can show leadership and encourage collaboration and dialogue between financial centres, between regulators and innovators, and between financial service providers, which can actually assist in the development of standards and benchmarks to improve the delivery of inclusive financial services. Showing leadership and supporting dialogue is possibly the most important part of this, because IFCs hold a unique position. They're unencumbered by political baggage, so their views are actually given weight by policymakers. IFCs are ideally placed to create a new agenda for change and the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. IBFC Labuan is showing the way for other financial centres, and I would really urge them to follow Labuan's example. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. After that presentation, I mean, the report is actually now available online on our website, www.labuanibfc.com. But we wanted to, before we go into the panel, and before I introduce the panel, what we really wanted to do this morning, is to ask you what you thought about the report, number one, via these poll questions, and just to have a bit of a response from you. So the first question is, given IFC's agnostic features which is further enhanced by the fact that we're not constrained by physical borders, do you agree that IFCs should be considered natural leaders in global financial inclusion initiatives? So either you agree or disagree. The next question is simpler still. Based on the findings of this report, of which the headlines you got from Simon's presentation earlier, do you agree that digitalization is an effective enabler of financial inclusion? So two very generic questions. We really hope you vote on these questions. Tell us if you agree, disagree, and we'll discuss your comments and the results during the panel. I'd like now to introduce our distinguished panel as well. So we have Professor Michael Manelli, Executive Chairman of the ZN Group, Dr. Nigina Siga, Research Director for Sustainable Finance at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and Andrew Paul, CEO at Gibraltar Stock Exchange Asia. So thank you everyone for joining me today. I hope you've had a chance to go through the headlines of the report at least. Can we see the results? So obviously our agnostic features, 84% agree that our agnostic features will encourage inclusion even further. The second question, do we have an answer for that? Yes, so yeah, absolutely. Almost 100% agree that, digitalization is an effective enabler for financial inclusion. So there is a slight gap there between, clearly digitalization is key towards inclusion and it's a great facilitator. But I guess the role of IFCs, we can further enhance that. So going to the panel itself. Thank you all of you for joining me. I really appreciate this, the time that you've put aside for this. We wanted to, what are your thoughts really? What are your thoughts about the findings of this quick poll, and what are your thoughts about the research piece itself? Maybe Professor Manelli, could I start with you, please?
Thank you very much, Farah, and a delight to be here. Yes, having contributed to the report, I clearly have a bit of an angle on it, but I do think there's some important points to make, and I believe that the audience has emphasized that. I think that intellectually, people get the message, but they don't really share the message. And the IFCs themselves need to develop that message into a simple way. And I think that's why, we're very pleased that you've tried to pick up the SDGs, digital inclusion, and take it forward. And I think to do that, it's probably interesting to look at the current state of IFCs around the world. Simon mentioned we have well over 100. When we began researching IFCs some 17, 18 years ago, we could only find about 40. So we're seeing this explosion. Finance is popping up everywhere as the world develops. But there are some problems. What made an IFC traditionally in most people's minds was something about taxation. But was that taxation simplification, which is what multinationals thought, or was it taxation avoidance? And we've certainly seen the recent moves amongst the G8 and the OECD that seem to imply that taxation shouldn't be something we compete on. That's a debate for another day. We also had anonymity and secrecy. Now, anonymity can be a good thing. If I've got wealth and possessions in a war-torn country, I might like to keep some of that anonymously. It's my property. That's one way to look at it. Another is I've secreted it away. But what I think has been missing amongst all of this is local knowledge and trade. And Simon emphasized the trade aspect. And I share one interesting figure, and that's that in 1970, 27% of global GDP was trade. And in 2019, that was 60%. Or sorry, I should rephrase that. Trade as a percentage of global GDP was 27% in 1970 and 60% in 2019. That's a 220% rise, and trade has largely driven the reduction of poverty over these last 50 years. And I think what we're now seeing, of course, is, okay, you reduce poverty, but financial inclusion is essential for society to make better decision amongst billions of people. And I believe that's where we're headed now. So, in terms of IFCs, clearly they need to work on the message. But I think what's nice about this is it's actually in their own natural interest. And so you seem to be trailblazing, and it'd be great if more piled behind you with a similar message.
Yeah, it seems almost logical, like everything else in life. The simpler the thinking, the chances are it will lead to something more concrete, I guess. And in a lot of instances, the whole pandemic that we are all suffering from has really, brought home the importance of raising the boat for everyone. And the idea that IFCs used to be the place where everyone goes to hide is no longer. It's just not the case anymore. And Labuan per se has never been one of those jurisdictions. So I guess for us it's a smaller ask for us to move into this new space. Dr. Nina, I wanted to bring you into the conversation now about, when we start looking at jurisdictions, and obviously all of us understand that jurisdictionally everyone competes. And competition jurisdictionally means legal provisions and, being more business friendly and things like that. But at the work that you do at the Institute, how do you see the global system looking to change than more just domestic greenwashing? I think a lot of what's happening now is actually customer, client or stakeholder demanding green initiatives, demanding inclusive initiatives. And you can see it in the great oil majors, right? And the change within their boards and things like that. Now, the question is really, what I'd like to put across is really the thinking, how do regulators ensure that their regulatees, i.e. their license holders, carry this inclusion mantle? Based on the work that you've done, how can we really effect a proper holistic change?
It's a very big question. Thank you, Farah. So I think of it in many different ways. One of them is when we've gone through, and we're still going through, the COVID pandemic, it has shown up a couple of things. It has shown up the inherent inequalities and the lack of inclusion, and it has shined light on the social aspect of sustainability, the aspect which had hitherto been really lagging behind the environmental thinking. The other thing that COVID has done is actually demonstrated that if you have a sustainable company and it's run sustainably, it has performed better through the COVID crisis. And that's both academic research as well as research by financial practitioners, which is really interesting. And we've known this for a long time, that sustainability is correlated with profitability, but it has been long looked at as a purely academic notion, not seen in the practitioner world. Whereas now we actually see this coming through into day-to-day functioning. And I'm just going to come back to slightly to the point that Michael was making, right? If we think about why that is, sustainable companies, through various certification processes, through various rating processes, have a better understanding of their supply chains, have a better understanding of where that trade is taking place, and where they're bringing their products, what their counterparties are, what their stakeholders are. That understanding enabled them to function better in the COVID situation, where suddenly you needed to really know where everything was coming from. You needed to understand kind of who was affected and in which jurisdictions. So it's an interesting question. Now, coming back to what you've asked me, which is how do regulators actually look at sustainability? And what we see is we do see a huge push around environmental, around green, around climate. Okay, let's not bunch nature together in climate with this, right? We see loads of regulation coming in. They're very fragmented though, And that's one of the big issues. And that's one of the issues where I can see a role for the international financial centers, is making it easier for multinationals to operate. Because if you're a multinational and you're looking at a multiplicity of jurisdictions with multiplicity of approaches to sustainability and to regulation, it becomes really, really difficult. It's even more difficult if you're an SME trying to operate in that space, because your resources and capacity is ultimately constrained. So if you look at alignment in understanding, alignment in a regulatory approach that allows that kind of that operation to take place, that's a really interesting space. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on is in the poll, I really like the phrasing of the second question around technology placing, fintech placing an enabling role. It's not a driver, because other things are going to be driving those things, but it is a major supporter. And it's enabling that transparency to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest with you, it's not just the transparency. I mean, we have a thriving digital ecosystem in Labuan. And when we first started looking at it, really, the cost efficiency that it provides, you know, the transparency is one thing. The cost efficiency in collapsing systems, you know, and I also have a question for Prof. Manelli about DeFi. So yeah, you know, when we start looking at financial systems and we start looking at efficiencies, maybe via fintech, that is probably just, you know, the lowest benefit, right? The simplest fruit to reap, as it were. But really, in peer-to-peer financial transactions in DeFi is really where the real benefit and the real cost efficiency and where the real transparency will lie. And I wanted to ask actually any one of you what your thoughts are with regards to DeFi. And really, you know, and I know this is not one of the questions that we prepared earlier, and I'm sorry, but, you know, what are your thoughts about how DeFi is going to change financial inclusion? And what are your thoughts about how DeFi is going to change the whole financial system, really? Anyone?
I'll kick in here, Farah, because I'm on the fence on DeFi. You know, one bit of DeFi is it's relatively undefined. It's a pretty messy term, and it evolves out of the sort of cryptocurrency space when they can't figure out the economics of cryptocurrency, so it's going to transform finance. If, on the other hand, I'm in a bit of a generous mood, I do think there's an important point there. So if we go back just a little second to Karl Marx, so Karl Marx popularized a then existing phrase, you know, from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs or whatever. I think one of the things we've got here is, you know, from each according to their abilities, fair enough, but to each according to their rights. And those rights can be economic rights, they can be equality rights, so, but just to their rights. It's been so hard to track that. You know, and I'll come to that in a second. And then I just want to bring in a point Nina made, which I thought was very, very important. It's about tracking. You know, we can achieve these SDGs, tremendous amounts of tracking that we can rely upon. So when you offer me something that's wholly sustainable, I can check that it is and that you haven't slipped in another product. You know, it's about trust in trade. Tracking is expensive. And the way that we've tracked, for example, rights in companies is with share registers and things. And this is probably somewhere where Andrew might want to kick in. So far, that technology has been pretty crude. And in fact, there have been a number of studies done on even the accuracy of existing very boring share registries, and they don't come out very well. So we need to improve our ability to track if we're going to have these billions of people and billions of equitable decisions. And perhaps they're peer-to-peer, perhaps they're through smaller centralized exchanges that don't have quite monopolistic rights. But nevertheless, we're going to need more of that if we're going to get there and do it in an inclusive way. So this is where a generous definition of DeFi might work. But the other bit to DeFi is a lot of the proponents of it seem to see it as some kind of global clockwork engine in which 8 billion people will be involved and blah, blah. That's possibly true in a theoretical sense, but we're already there, arguably, with the state of the internet now, leaving aside, as Simon pointed out, maybe an eighth of the planet. But what the IFCs will contribute is the local knowledge. And I think the IFCs will allow that decentralization to happen. Otherwise, it would all come through London or Singapore or New York or something. That's clearly not the world that we're going to be living in. So I believe a combination of really improved tracking of all sorts of things, whether it's products or finance, the rights that are accorded with it, and the decentralization of that is an important movement for mankind.
Yeah, completely. And Andrew, do you want to come in here? Because obviously, settlement, clearing, trading, exchange. Tell us, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, well, I would probably say, look, it's more going to be keyhole surgery. So I don't say throw out the entire financial system. I'm sure there's problems when it comes to settlement. So, for example, we've had electronic trading in bonds. I was at the forefront of that 20 years ago. That revolutionized the market. That was financial inclusion 1.0, I would suggest, because in the old days, it was like Trading Places, that old movie, which maybe Michael and I remember. People on the floor, it was very manual. So that's been a paradigm change. But the problem is in the settlement. So, for example, you trade electronically in Thailand. There is a semblance of financial inclusion because Thai companies can raise capital, and people can invest in that. But it takes 15 days to settle across 8 different repositories. So clearly, maybe not the guys who are trading, but it's the settlement processes which are the problem. So maybe to pivot back to what Simon said, it's the intersection of responsible finance and fintech. And I think responsible finance, I mean, this is back to you, Farah. I mean, I would suggest you do need to have some type of a regulator there, some type of arbiter. Sure, it doesn't have to be Big Brother, but this is exactly the role of the of the IFCs. So to sort of paraphrase the Oracle, IFCs need to facilitate global plumbing of finance, trade, risk, and asset management intermediation, right? So I do agree with Michael, but it's going to be keyhole surgery. I think it's going to be, you don't just throw everything out, because the other you've already mentioned the T word, taxation, and how I agree with you. Labuan's never been a tax play. It's always been about, a quick, to provide a platform for innovation. Likewise, we've heard the C word already being mentioned, crypto. And I'd also suggest there, if it is left unfettered, we're going to have all the questions which have been asked about certain participants at the moment, and there could be a race to the bottom. So it's got to be a harmonized approach where we do bring incumbents. And I would say the incumbents are coming to the table. And sure, BlackRock, Mr. Fink is talking about ESG. We haven't spoken about ESG and the intersection between ESG and SDG and an exchange's role there. But I think, look, DeFi has its place, but a regulated paradigm within a jurisdiction such as Labuan is a very powerful tool, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think, and maybe I'm a lone wolf here, but, I feel that as the plumbing of the global system, that's where the beauty lies, really, because you're not jurisdictionally bound, and you're allowed to innovate.
And can I just say, look, even though we've just got a conditional license and we shouldn't be facilitating business, I can tell you anecdotally, the SDG goals have already been implemented in information memorandums by potential issuers. So when it comes not to the E, I'm getting information sheets where they actually spell out their ESG principles. And there's also now moving to the S. So for Australia, for example, you have regenerative farming who wants to have Indigenous Australians or First Australians inclusion. So that can be done using IoT technology, APIs, and smart contracts. And smart contracts are already being implemented by ISDA, the International Association of Swap Dealers. So basically, this is already happening with the incumbents. So yes, again, DeFi has its place, but let's give some of these incumbents a chance as well to adopt this technology.
Yeah.
step in for one
Nina.
little
Yes.
comment? So I think it's interesting, right? When we talk about DeFi, we tend to look at it as, here's the incumbents, and that's how they're going online, how they're using technology. And then there is the rest of it. And I think someone was talking about, insurance provision. Mutual microinsurance is a great example, for example, where you can actually innovate and look at DeFi in that context, where DeFi is acting as additive to the existing plumbing. And I'm just going to say one more thing. I think, when we talk about deregulation, when we talk about technology, we need to think about as well what we're building into those algorithms, right? No algorithm comes in unbiased. And what we're currently building in carries particular biases with them, and it carries the biases of those who are writing that code. So we need to think at the start of the journey, what the market might look like 5-10 years on, and try to build in proper principles of its operation so that we don't end up in the subprime prime world of the financial crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting listening to everyone, because really it just points out to me personally anyway that the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. So, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, keyhole surgery, and biasness, right? Within the algorithms, within the AIs, let's say, that actually will be driving a lot of what we do. I wanted to come back to Andrew actually to talk a little bit about his potentially future digital exchange and how his what are your thoughts with regards to inclusion there, and how would a digital exchange, a commercial digital exchange like the Gibraltar Stock Exchange out of Asia in Labuan, how would an exchange like that really push forward the inclusion agenda? And obviously it's important that you are located in a jurisdictionally neutral environment, but how would you ensure that all your issuers and investors adhere to this very, in my mind, a very personal philosophy really of inclusion?
Well, I think it's, look, I think it's a step in this journey, Farah. So I think, first of all, specifically for the GSX group, to the point mentioned before about IFCs, just because it's a small jurisdiction, my point is that doesn't mean, you have to be a bunch of cowboys. So I think within the GSX group, we've always adhered to regulation. And we heard Nina mention, the financial crisis. So out of that came ESMA in Europe. So we kind of operate currently in Europe under a very strong jurisdiction. So all these concepts of MTFs, multilateral trading facilities, which all has at the core the individual, this concept of agency. That was a response to agency 10 years ago, but sure, we have to kind of work through that. And now we come to the next intersection of, as Simon mentioned, fintech and responsible finance. So how we envisage, to sort of just to mention that we now have a new majority shareholder in our operations out here in Asia, but we envisage it as being a exchange as a service. So we have these different verticals. Some may be crypto, some may be some more traditional finance. So in theory, we have the platform to have DeFi, traditional finance, to sort of fill the spectrum. What I envisage that a particular vertical which I will run will be bonds, but bonds seems to be the best segue to green finance. Sure, there's been lots of problems with green bonds and greenwashing, etc. But let's start with green bonds, so ESG principled bonds, adhering to the SDG principles such as 7 and 13. When it comes to climate or some of the specific principles there. So let's, under a regulatory framework, see what we can do and how can we use smart contracts, how can we use Internet of Things. So for example, an Australian farmer who wants to look at rainwater and the response to a drought which has just happened down there, how can he have responsible regenerative agriculture and look at salinity, etc. Maybe smart contracts is an answer, where we have the Internet of Things, where we measure rainwater, and if rain falls above 50 millimeters, he pays LIBOR or whatever the benchmark interest rate is plus a premium. And if it's a drought conditions, he pays LIBOR minus a premium. And then we can look at the S part. If they're using Indigenous Australians to help out with these new agricultural ventures, and there's inclusion and further rights for Indigenous Australians. Can we look at payroll data? So this is already happening, even with horrible iron ore companies like Fortescue Minerals. They're actually Twiggy Forrest, who runs it. Maybe their iron ore isn't as good as BHP's, but in the future, I can see Norgus Bank saying, "Look, I would rather buy stocks in Fortescue because they have an Indigenous Australian employment program, and we can take that data from APIs." And so this is actually becoming very measurable. So it's all about tracing and ensuring adherence to these principles. So from a technological point of view, I don't see much of a problem. Maybe I'm been a bit naive here, but I don't think we're far off from doing this. So yeah, I'm very bullish about the opportunity to help issuers, list on our exchange platform. I've already been sounded out by people, as I alluded to before, who actually want to do this, and they're actually telling me their ESG goals. So yeah, I think the wheels are in motion.
It's always song. Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm done talking football. But seriously though, it seems like it's a coming together, and it seems like there is a tipping point with the COVID, with the pandemic, with really just a general awareness. And some even argue that it's off the back of this huge net zero movement, where it starts with climate in a way, and then it's pushing through the facilitation of climate change via financial services. I don't know what your thoughts are, any of you, but please jump in. What I'm trying to allude to is going back to international financial centers, and the thinking that international financial centers have always been like this dark hole of where everyone goes to hide stuff. And now we're in the forefront of innovation, digitalization, a standardized taxation rate that if it all goes through in the next couple of years, we're all going to have to adopt. I was wondering what your thoughts are, Professor Manelli, about how you've seen financial centers evolve, and what your thoughts are with regards to maybe our role in the next 10 years vis-a-vis inclusion, a more equitable, towards creating a more equitable society, really.
Well, thank you. I'll stick, if I might, Farah, really to the green aspects, or the carbon net zero 2050 aspects. And I know Nina knows this subject well. Andrew pointed out that there's a class of bonds that have been emerging, and we at ZN have been behind this movement for some 17 years or so. They're called various things: policy performance bonds, performance incentive bonds, ESG linked bonds, SDG linked bonds, etc. But it has been a bit of a response to the greenwashing of the bonds that exist. Most of the bonds that exist were basically use of proceeds bonds. Give me a lot of money and I promise I'll spend it nicely on something. The new class of bonds, which might comprise something like 35% of the market this year in terms of value, are actually saying, I'm going to meet this outcome. If I fail to meet this outcome, then I'll pay more interest, a bit like Andrew's point earlier about farmers. These are quite interesting because they're tied to real goals, but they also need local knowledge. I mean, it's one thing for somebody like Shell to issue a bond like that, but how am I going to deal with somebody in Borneo who seems to be doing the right thing and I want to invest, but I can't track it? So we come back to that tracking point again. I think another thing is I'm not a big fan of the ESG movement in the way that it's been evidenced. I'm a big ESG fan. It's where I've been for 40 plus years. But the current ESG movement is one where the financial industry is going out and rating other entities on things it knows, frankly, very little about. There was a recent study by MIT, I think, anyway, it's about the confusion in the sector, where they found that 20% of them in one category were in the bottom 5% of another, and it was just a complete mess. That's not the way to do it. But people have shied away from the right answer. And the right answer was carbon trading. That would have a vastly greater effect than a bunch of analysts wandering around on a theory that slightly raising the cost of capital will make a difference. For those listeners out there, this is what we thought about apartheid, that we would march and our universities would divest, and then suddenly South Africa would abolish apartheid because the investments would be slightly more expensive. That never worked. And it's not really working at all in the climate change space. If anything, it's just driving revenue generating brown businesses into private equity. So what we really need to do is just get on with where we were in 97. Let's start charging. China has seen this. We saw at the beginning of this month the launch of their ETS. So there's a seventh of the planet moving in that direction. Europe has seen it. The UK is a bit out of it. Biden at least declared a price for carbon of $51 a ton back in February. So, there's a movement on that. That bites. Current prices of carbon at 50 or whatever are probably about half the level they need to be. You make it $100, you're going to avoid carbon. You don't need a fancy report. You don't need PwC, EY, KPMG to go over your accounts because they don't even know what they're doing in the first place. Let's get on with the carbon price. And again, at that level, I think IFCs have a role to play. These are going to have to be local markets if they're going to be policed. I won't know what that Borneo chap or gal is doing. It's going to have to be a local issue.
I mean, just a quick, sorry. Just to say, look, that's a potential vertical as well of the GSX group. And as Michael's saying, look, the big catalyst is also going to be next year when Europe comes in, shipping, basically every ship leaving the EU and going back has to have carbon offset. So I've seen prices here as low as $5. Michael talks about 50. All my trading mates are talking about, they've seen prints of $150. So definitely this is going to have an impact. There is already voluntary carbon offsets happening here, and look, Singapore wants to be at the fulcrum there. So they just announced this 6 exchange, the Climate Impact Exchange. So it's the usual suspects: DBS, MAS, Temasek. But I think Michael's right. There needs to be the catalyst, and I think the catalyst may be just around the corner if it's not already here.
I agree, Nina.
I'm just thinking about how, as an academic, I think about framework sometimes. So how do we transition? There are 3 levers for transition, and that actually works for carbon. It works for nature. There is the regulation lever, there is the innovation lever, and then there is the sentiment lever, right? So how do we, on the one hand, how do we work with regulation to align around the sustainability paradigm? How do we track the pricing in terms of renewable technologies, in terms of carbon pricing, to actually address the innovation gap, as well as how do we move that sentiment, investor sentiment, political sentiment, consumer sentiment, and what we're changing, which is the risks, the opportunities, and the operations. So where do the International Financial Center sit in that, right? They look at aligning that regulation scope. They look at providing opportunities for innovation to kick in, for pricing to start changing, as well as they drive that capacity, that information, that knowledge exchange that will help sentiment move and hopefully manage that transition so that we don't fall off of a cliff effectively, because that's currently what we're looking at. Is at some point, you keep on going the way we're going, and then at some point it becomes unmanageable and we disruptively transition. And that's the avoidance. That's what we're trying to avoid. We're not thinking about whether we will transition into a sustainable world. We're just thinking about how and when, and whether it'll be a managed or a very disruptive, unmanaged transition where the world spooks and closes down.
Yeah, it just goes from one end to the other. And really, at the end of the day, it's something that's manageable, has to be sustainable, and has to be workable in a real world, like nuts and bolts, and that's why the whole concept of carbon trading, carbon storage, and $50 is one thing, but yeah, as you say, Prof, the thinking is that it's not going to make much of an impact until it goes to above 100. And yes, the idea, coming from a capital markets background, the idea of having a domestic stock exchange makes sense, right? But the idea of having a domestic carbon exchange just doesn't. right? Because what you're going to need to do is actually bring in regional players. You're going to need to bring in regional carbon usage, regional carbon offset needs. And that is probably where the possibility will lie for a center, a jurisdictional center, you know, a non-jurisdictional center, as it were. That's possible. Yes, please.
Sorry, Farah, I'm just thinking, so because I think, you know, when we talk about climate, it's relatively easy. There is one metric that we're optimizing towards, right? When we talk about nature, it's much more difficult. And there I see actually a lot more opportunities for IFCs to step in, because with nature, we are optimizing on a particular locality. We're optimizing on a particular geography, and we need deep knowledge of nature-based solutions that will apply within a particular region, right? As well as the attracting financial capital to stabilize those solutions. So there it feels to me like, yes, there is a huge amount of space to operate within the carbon world, but within the nature world, the opportunity is absolutely massive. And now is really the time to start stepping into that opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, so Michael mentioned, you know, sort of Karl Marx and the Marxian view. Look, I think that there is some validity, you know, maybe, you know, when I was at university, we're all taught, you know, Milton Friedman, it's all about, you know, it's all about the shareholder returns. But I think, you know, that model is problematic. And as the point which Simon was talking about, agency. So if you think about the journey of the investor or the small kampong in Malaysia, people getting together to create something of value. And then Simon talked about crowdfunding, and then maybe, you know, that becomes a private company. And then potentially we can bring in sort of these concepts of KYC and who these people are, identity. And so when we do actually, if this company is successful and they do want to produce long-term benefits for society, then they can list on an exchange where the broader public can partake in it. But, you know, to the values which, you know, the ZN report came out. So I think this concept, I mean, there's already exchange in California, it's called the long-term capital exchange, where people are questioning this whole sort of Friedman-esque view of the world. So I think, yeah, there's this. So again, the IFCs can partake in this sort of starting up the digital kampong, the family company, and if successful, you know, this grab, you know, taking it to the exchange. And we've already actually seen this happening with the Spotify IPO, where you didn't need the big Goldman Sachs roadshow. Basically, you had even Grab that basically raised money. Sure, they might be doing a SPAC, whatever, but basically they're kind of eschewing most of the services of my old colleagues in investment banking and just listing it on a regulated platform. So there's definitely something out there, which maybe Michael might add. Maybe if you're talking as a Marxian or Marxist theory, but I do think there is some validity there vis-a-vis Friedman.
Well, you've got a great point there. It's always been this issue of mutuality and independence in exchanges. And the rise of high frequency trading is an interesting one, because if you go back to before the privatization, now I'll speak only in a UK context, but we had sets and things like that. So we did not have the primacy of first in, first out, because it was run as a mutual, and the banks that owned it didn't want to get taken to the cleaners. When they privatized the exchange, trading volumes dropped just after the .com, and the exchange went back to the banks and said, we'd like a bit more money. The bank said, well, we don't owe it to you anymore. We're customers now. So, and they were charging on a per exchange, per transaction charges. So they wound up having to go for more transactions. And they basically went to the West End, to all the hedge funds, and said, come on in with better computer systems, because the banks aren't very bright. And when everybody woke up to that around 2005, as high frequency trading took off, the banks came back and said, wait, stop all this stuff. We're getting taken to the cleaners. And the exchange said, well, you're basically just a customer like all the rest. What did they do? Well, then they formed Turquoise and Boat, which were mutuals. So you go in these kind of constant cycles in that sector. But I agree with you. We should be moving away from the primacy of first in, first out. And I know about that, and, you know, the speed bump approaches and all sorts of things there. But I think there's another point I just might want to make, because I know we're coming to time. And it was just inspired really by Farah, your point about, there is no need for anything other than a global exchange, perhaps in carbon. And Nina, your point about, the localization. And I think it goes back in some ways to the tradability of something. So if you look at carbon, you can go to Mauna Loa and you can take a sample and you'll be off by, part per million, maybe in the UK, but it doesn't matter. It's all being spread. And so we can trade on that, and that's global. The minute you move to, say, something like wood products, it's tradable, but there is a local component. You try and trade water. Well, the darn stuff is so heavy. It's very, very difficult. And then we get down to, say, biodiversity, and I'll stick to the megafauna. There are more subtle points to make, but I can't trade my Komodo dragon for your polar bear. They won't last very long unless we're talking about zoos. So, and the closer you get to the difficulties in trade, the more you need local trade, and the more role an IFC has to play. So I agree with you on the carbon, though I think there will be some localization there, because there are a few sophisticated bits to how you do the credits and what the legal system is in which those credits are exchanged. I remember that when I helped set up the ETS here in the UK in the late 90s. So we had those sorts of problems, and there are some local issues in even there, but you're broadly right. And then I think, Nina, you're broadly right as well, that we're going to have to be extremely local in other aspects, and IFCs will have more role to play the more local it is. Yeah.
This has been a tremendously interesting conversation, actually, in the sense that it provides a platform for further thought. It really is quite interesting for us to start looking at the possibility how Labuan can evolve and really fulfill its role regionally. That for us is very important. But we've actually run out of time, I've just been told, but I just wanted to go around to all the panelists and just to see if you've got any last words for the audience before we leave them. Nina, ladies first, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Farah. I think my call to arms in this space is look into the sustainability space and understand how the world is changing and contribute to that change.
Thank you. Gentlemen. Andrew, would you like to start, or would you like to?
Oh, no, I think definitely, IFCs have a role to play. I didn't mention Islamic finance, particularly in this part of the world. So I think, sure, Islamic finance is very decentralized. Sure, there's only one word, but, if a cleric in say, Malaysia comes up with a Wakaf principle investment, let's go to Labuan and let's implement it. So, yeah, so it's sort of a Nina point on localization, but it's also the HSBC logo, what Michael was saying, sort of globalization. So a global religion and putting some of their best practices into place. Yeah, so let's do that.
So it's your local regional bank or your global regional bank or something like this. Yeah. Professor Manelli?
I think I would only echo that. Simon concluded his excellent presentation with, international financial centers are basically local neutral platforms for the facilitation of trade. And I think that's what IFCs need to focus on and understand how trade contributes to all of the SDGs and makes the world a better place. And it does, but we need to get that message out.
Yeah, thank you. And for me, thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. I really did enjoy this conversation. To my peers in other financial centers, I think, we should all work together towards creating something that's going to be sustainable and something we can all be proud of in the future. I really encourage you to download the report, which is available on our website. And once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.